Okay, so this was a really fun match because of the way it sort of ended. This was against a random person online. This was a 10-minute rapid game, and it started off with me on white. So it was knight to c3. He opens up with a king's pawn. Surprise, surprise. Then I open up with a d-file pawn to d4. He decides to move his black pawn up one on his queen's pawn. I move up my king's pawn as I normally do. This is my typical opening. Um, Black knight, threatening here. I go ahead and move up, threatening the knight. He moves in between, so I go ahead and threaten with bishop. Opens the h file. I take, he takes, I take, putting me up one pawn. From here, he threatens my queen, so I move and put him in check. He threatens with bishop, and so I move back to where I was, blocking the pawn on the c file with my queen. He moves his knight, threatening the e-pawn as well as the protected d-pawn. I move my knight up, and he moves his g-pawn up a square. I castle queenside. He puts me in check with the black bishop, so I just move over a little bit. He castles kingside, um, which is interesting because he doesn't have much protection here. So I move b pawn up one. He opens up a file, so he is trying to get these rooks out. Um, Move my pawn up here, threatening the knight. From here, he takes a while to think, but eventually he decides to take. I take, and now threatening this bishop. Uh, he moves his pawn to b6, and so I move my queen to threaten the knight here. This wasn't necessarily a great move because obviously he just moves his pawn here, and I move back to where I was, and he gained a little development. He moves his knight to g4. I take, and so he double stacks his pawns on the g file, and I block it with my g pawn. He moves his black queen, finally getting her into the fray, threatening this knight on the c file. So I move my rook right here because she's also threatening this pawn right here on the f file that I don't want her to take. So he really is stacking his pieces on here, getting very aggressive. He moves his black bishop here, pinning this pawn, which was already pinned by the knight up here. Not able to take it because I would just take with my king. From here, I go ahead and threaten a trade as an attempt to protect this. He accepts, and we take. So now I have a double stack on the d file. But notice how it is unprotected, and it can go forward. This is going to be essential as soon as this queen is out of the way. So he moves his rook over here to give him a very nice look on the e file. I move my king up to add an extra layer of protection to this knight, and he moves his queen right here, creating threat on both this pawn and this one as well. I follow up by defending with my rook here, which is interesting because this rook is already defending it, so I don't know what I was thinking there. He moves his black bishop to g7, adding more pressure than there already was on this knight. So I move my rook over here to kind of give it an extra layer of protection. He moves his queen to threaten this rook right here, because now if I move the rook, which I do, I move it right here, he takes the one pawn that he's able to, tying us up. So from here, I start moving up this pawn because, as you know, because of that, he now has his queen all the way over here. It is not possible to get there in time. So he moves his his rook right here in an attempt to threaten this pawn. And so I move my queen to b5. So now if he takes with this rook, then I have a free take on his rook on the white square, putting him in check, which would be a 4-point loss for him. He didn't want that, so he backed off. I move my pawn up once more. We're now one square away from promotion, also threatening the rook. So he blocks it, and from here, I grab my rook, and I set it up to threaten his king, threaten his rook. And so after this, he sees this and he wants to move it right here so that he can take it out with this pawn. I move my rook to e8, putting him in check. He thinks for a while, and he decides to take. I take back and promote to queen, putting him back in check. He moves his king away. I check him again from here, moves it again, check, and then he moves it down here, and then check here, protects with his bishop, and then checkmate on h6, two queens, and he's completely trapped from his own pawns. And this match ended up being 36 moves, and it was a really fun one.